presentation.
Okay, welcome everybody to our graduate student panel 2. My name is Casey Retmeister, and I'll just be in charge of time here. The way in which we'll kind of set this up is we'll do roughly 20 minutes for each presentation. When it gets close to 20 minutes, I'll just put something in the chat and let you know to wrap it up. And then 5 minutes of questions. If you want to go less than 20 minutes, that's fine. Try not to go too much over 20 minutes, just so we have time for conversation and discussion. So our first speaker is Rachel Dichter. Her paper is titled Social Media in Relation to the COVID-19 Anti-Lockdown Protests, a Threat to Peace and a Source of Hope. So we welcome Rachel.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming and for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to present here. If anyone looked at the abstract for this talk, I have to apologize since my paper evolved considerably after I submitted it to the conference. So the talk I'm giving does not exactly align with what I said there. But I do have a handout on the on my academia.edu page, and I've posted the link or pasted it rather in the chat. So hopefully you can follow along there. This talk focuses on one of the big models for evaluating online information sharing that has been developed by Edward Spence. And my primary objective is to show that a problem with the model very clearly arises when we try to use it to evaluate online acts that make an intended contribution to anti-lockdown protesters' behavior. So I'll start out by introducing the model. It has two parts. It's called DOIT Wisdom. So the parts are DOIT and Wisdom, respectively. And in some of Spence's earlier work, DOIT is introduced as a standalone theory for ethics of information sharing, but it's based on the idea that online information sharing is carried out through online communicative acts with a double normative structure. And so there are two norms. The first is epistemic, although I think it's debatable whether it's really an epistemic norm since it's a norm of assertion. And that norm generates an obligation to tell the truth when you're communicating online. And the second norm is an explicitly moral norm of rights respectingness, and that generates an obligation not to directly violate anyone's rights when sharing information. And the two rights that Spence has in mind here are really two of the ones specified by the ethicist Alan Gaworth, and those are rights to self-fulfillment and well-being as he discusses them. So an act that violates either of the norms is wrong, and one that meets both is right, according to this account. And so the second part of the DOIT wisdom model is wisdom, and that's a teleological account that evaluates all information sharing in relation to an Aristotelian notion of eudaimonia. And promoting the good life for oneself or others is valuable, Spence wants to say. And so acting in accordance with wisdom is right. And he gives a specific definition of wisdom as KLSA, and that means wise acts are acts that demonstrate a successful application of knowledge about how to achieve eudaimonia or help others do so. And it's interesting here to think about the presentation of wisdom by Spence as a meta virtue, or one that can explain the rightness or wrongness of online acts as they're described in terms of their conformity or lack thereof to DOIT's two obligations. And another way of thinking about this is you think the virtuous agent, according to DOIT, has certain dispositions to meet the two obligations of that theory, truth-telling and respecting others' rights. And those dispositions are presumably contributing to a disposition to act in accordance with wisdom or promote the good life. But what's wrong with applying this model to acts of information sharing that play an intended causal role in anti-lockdown protesters' behavior is that there's more involved in promoting the good life than there is involved in meeting the two obligations of DOIT. And I'll spend the rest of my time explaining what that means, but I just want to say first what I mean by the online acts that make an intended causal contribution to anti-lockdown protesters' behavior, because I'm saying that a lot. So I mean those posts on social media that anti-lockdown protesters put out there for the purpose of facilitating those protests. either by giving people logistical information like times or dates, or by giving reasons to people to come out and protest. And arguably, the people who posted those things intended to cause their audiences to act in accordance with whatever information they were posting. And so that's the sense in which these posts play an intended causal role in anti-lockdown protesters' behavior. But anyway, it's plausible that those online acts that contribute to anti-lockdown protesters' behavior are wrong. That is not really my personal opinion. In fact, I'm very sympathetic actually to some of the arguments that people have given for protesting. And I'm aware of the financial hardships that have been caused by the pandemic for a lot of people. But to make this argument using the DOIT wisdom model, all it takes is to show that anti-lockdown protesters' behavior is wrong, which again is debatable. But if we consider the theme of this conference, peace, and that these protests are a threat to peace, we can see why this argument goes through. So this argument draws on an insight from peace studies, namely Andrew Fiala's book, Transformative Pacifism. And there he argues that pacifism can be understood as a teleological evaluative theory that takes peace to be the highest good. And if you think the peaceful life is the good life, you can even frame pacifism in terms of Spence's account of wisdom. And it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to say that the acts that contribute to long-term peace apply knowledge about how to live well and help others do so. But anti-lockdown protests promote the opposite of long-term peace, which is violence. So they're actually a threat to long-term peace. How? Well, the protests themselves are pretty clearly instances of short-term violence, but the people involved are also protesting social distancing measures and lockdown orders. And these are goals whose achievement would cause an uptick in COVID-19 cases and more widespread illness. And I actually argue in this paper that spreading illness in and of itself is not a form of violence, because first, illness is a purely descriptive concept, and this is also a controversial point. Garrett Merriam, who's actually one of the attendees at this conference, pointed out to me at a different version of this talk that this is a controversial point, with proponents, including Christopher Borse, in the article on the distinction between disease and illness. And the opposing view is normativism about health, which says judgments of health include value judgments. But even if that view is plausible when it comes to some illnesses, the concept of testing positive for COVID-19 seems like it doesn't, superficially at least, include a value judgment as part of its content, since saying someone tests positive involves the judgment that the person in question has the genetic material, the virus, in their body, and that's a pretty descriptive notion. But regardless, it's extensionally pretty clear that the concepts of violence and illness don't have overlap, because everything in the extension of violence has a certain causal history. That is, it's brought about intentionally by an agent, and nothing in the extension of the term illness has that kind of causal history unless that illness was spread intentionally or weaponized. So even extensionally, we have no reason to think that spreading illness in and of itself is a form of violence or is identical to violence. But increased rates of illness can still create conditions in which violence is likely to arise, and that's something we can predict based on what has happened in the past when too many people were ill. Like last spring, for instance, everyone was panic buying certain foods and toilet paper, and that caused some disruptive shortages. And we can imagine that if that went on for long enough, there would be competition for resources, since there has been a well-documented link in the peace studies literature between resource scarcity and violence. And doctors in overcrowded hospitals also have to make decisions about which people to treat when hospitals are overcrowded. And that's arguably violence by omission for people who hold that that's possible, since people who've defended that notion say it involves someone's making a conscious choice to act in a way that's harmful to someone. And the choices doctors make to save one person and not another seem to meet those criteria, although that's also maybe controversial. So we see via the peace studies route or using wisdom that the protests are a threat to peace and are wrong. And I'm claiming we can infer from this claim that anti-lockdown protesters' behavior is a threat to peace, that the online information sharing that makes an intended contribution to it is a threat to peace if we consider wisdom. And this is, or more broadly, that it's wrong. These posts are wrong if we consider wisdom, because they make an intended contribution to behavior that's wrong. And so it follows from wisdom that in sharing them, the person who did so was not successfully applying knowledge about how to live well or help others do so. So I just argued that acts of information sharing online that make an intended causal contribution to anti-lockdown protesters' behavior are not acts in accordance with wisdom, because they don't promote the good life, which is the peaceful life, we might think. And at this point, we might be thinking that if DOIT and wisdom really are a unified value theory, there should be an explanation for the wrongness of those acts of online information sharing we're discussing at the level of obligations if they're not promoting the good life. That is, they should be violating one of the obligations of the theory or one of the obligations specified by DOIT. And remember that there were two obligations of DOIT: to be truthful and to respect others' rights. And so if the acts we're talking about are wrong because of their failure to contribute to the good life, they should do one of those things. And some of them do. Some of the posts clearly are disseminating false information, denying the existence of the pandemic, calling it a plandemic, or saying that masks are not effective at stopping the spread of COVID, which is scientifically dubious. And these posts clearly violate the epistemic obligation to refrain from disseminating false information. But some of these posts just include logistical information about protest dates or give reasons for protesting that are not conspiratorial, like economic hardship. And it's not clear that these posts either demonstrate or either disseminate false information or violate anyone's rights. And it's also not the case that any of the posts that play an intended causal role in anti-lockdown protesters' behavior violate anyone's rights directly, in the same way that sharing nude photos of someone online or committing hate speech would directly constitute a violation of someone's rights. And so I think that shows that maximizing the good according to wisdom is not the same thing as always fulfilling the two obligations of DOIT. And that's a problem. And to explain the problem slightly differently, you can think of DOIT and wisdom as two different components of a value theory. So the deontic component is DOIT, and that lays out obligations, and the axiological component is wisdom, and that offers an account of the good, which in this case is the good life. And it's not unreasonable to expect right actions to maximize the good if there's only one good and everything that doesn't promote the good is not good, which is the situation we're in with DOIT wisdom. But as we've seen, there are some actions that meet both of DOIT's obligations and still don't promote the good life specified by wisdom, which means there are some acts that are permissible according to those obligations that aren't promoting the good life. And some of the acts that bear an intended causal contribution to anti-lockdown protesters' behavior fall into that category and really nicely illustrate that point. Here, though, one might raise a concern about supererogation. Maybe the right acts of a value theory don't need to maximize the good, is the concern, because maybe promoting wisdom or like promoting the ultimate good is actually going above and beyond the call of duty. And to really be in good standing, you just have to meet DOIT's two obligations. Anything else is extra. I don't find that convincing precisely because there's only one source of value according to wisdom, and everything that deviates from promoting that therefore promotes something that's not good. So in other words, all of the acts that don't promote the good life in accordance with wisdom promote some other kind of life. And so if there's only one good life and acts in accordance with wisdom promote the good life, all acts that don't promote the one good life promote some other kind of life, which is a bad life, or a life that stands in opposition to the good life exemplified by wisdom. So it would be a strange feature of the theory if agents performing acts that accorded with the promotion of a bad life succeeded in meeting all of their ethical obligations. But we already saw that more is required of the person who wants to promote the good life than just fulfilling those two obligations of DOIT. And so we can conclude that the deontic component of DOIT wisdom really needs to have more obligations than just the two. if we want to resolve the misfit problem. So as I've argued, these examples involving posts that play an intended causal role in anti-lockdown protesters' behavior can clarify the issues with the DOIT wisdom model and its evaluation of digital information online. And I'll end with a few words on whether social media has any redeeming qualities in the pandemic, whether it can serve as a source of hope. And some countries have actually used social media-driven mental health initiatives to combat depression during the pandemic. People have also written about the potential value of social media for making friends and keeping in touch with connections when you can't see people in person. I don't think we have that much reason to be optimistic that social media will prevent enough anti-lockdown protesters from protesting in order to cease being a threat. As nice as the online mental health initiatives being implemented are, it's not clear that anti-lockdown protesters are motivated by poor mental health or anything that more mental health resources could resolve. And there's an article in Ethics and Information Technology by Froding and Peterson, which argues that on an Aristotelian model of friendship, online friendships are not really equivalent to genuine friendships, but are a reduced form of social exchange. And I think finally, if we think that anti-lockdown protests have been a threat to peace, clearly those involved were either influenced by social media or using social media to share information about protests. And they had some familiarity with the internet and were not deterred. So if we think that they're a threat to peace, we can conclude that the internet has not deterred enough of the would-be anti-lockdown protesters who use it to cease being a threat to peace. So yeah, thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Rachel. So if you'd like to pose a question, just please put it in the Zoom webinar chat box, and I'll give a minute or two for people to do that. We have plenty of time.
What is the logical force of the initial sympathy that you feel for the anti-lockdown protesters? Well, I don't know if it's logical force, but I do know people personally who have lost their jobs. Like my former housemate was an AV guy who did like lights and sound for events. And he was laid off in the beginning of the pandemic and had to go back to live with his parents. And so I think there are legitimate financial concerns that people have as a result of this pandemic. And so they might be protesting lockdowns on that basis. And so that's one reason I'm sympathetic, because the pandemic has hit certain people harder than others, and especially people working in certain careers. So.
Other questions for Rachel? So Greg has a follow-up. How is their concern for well-being then unwise?
I think that is subject for debate. In my presentation and in this paper, I made an argument that it's unwise because in the long run, achieving the goals they're promoting would be a threat to peace. But I think someone could also take the opposite line probably and say, if lockdowns continue for long enough, that could really threaten peace in another sense by creating economic hardship for a lot of people, and that could lead to violence. So It is a question.
Yeah, I think just to kind of follow up with what you just said, Rachel, I think it depends on how long the lockdown is and how taxing it is on the people, obviously. So I think there's contingency there. I would agree with you. Other questions? So Derek, can you read
So,
that, Rachel? Yep.
yeah, sure. I see how social media is insufficient to provide emotional support to protesters, but it seems necessary for epistemic reasons, where those epistemic reasons have a direct influence on one's emotional attitudes. Could you clarify for what it's necessary? Like epistemic reasons for what? Like,
Maybe it would just be better if I spoke.
Yeah, feel free to speak, Derek.
Yeah. I sort of get the impression that if epistemic shortcomings are a partial explanation of defective emotional attitudes, that there has to be some sort of solution, right? Based in epistemic reasons, right? If epistemic shortcomings are a major explanation of like bad sentiment, that's motivating protesters to threaten peace, right? In what way would we try to remedy that by through epistemic means?
I think like there is probably something to be said for public health campaigns that disseminate truthful information about COVID-19 and preventing spread. And I don't want to diminish the value of those initiatives, but I also wonder whether those initiatives would convince anyone who would otherwise protest. I mean, that's not really something I touched, just because, yeah, in order to argue that social media isn't a real source of hope, I mean, I didn't really need to address that issue. But I also think it's hard empirically to assess that, or even non-empirically to assess whether people are actually going to be convinced by public health campaigns when they would otherwise go out and protest lockdowns.
Dean has a question in the chat for you, Rachel.
Cool. The question is, could you speak more on the topic of how you determine that an anti-lockdown protest is a threat to peace versus another type of protest, such as other types of civil rights protests? That's a good question. And I argue that it's a threat to peace because it's a threat to long-term peace as opposed to short-term peace that's promoting, or like a threat to short-term peace that promotes aims that would be conducive to long-term peace. So I think in civil rights cases, there's an argument that even though there was some disturbance, even in cases of violent protest, even if there was some short-term violence, that short-term violence made a contribution to long-term peace. Whereas I think in this argument, when I said that anti-lockdown protesters' achievement of their objectives would lead to more widespread illness, that was supposed to support this point that it would prolong this violent period of COVID-19 and all of the symptoms of violence that come with it, like overcrowding in hospitals and resource scarcity.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer to that. Are there any more questions? We got about a minute or two, and then we'll move on to Derek. Okay, Rachel, great job. Appreciated that talk.
Thanks,
The
everyone.
next,
Thanks for the questions.
yeah, the next speaker is Derek Hughes. And the title is Virtuous Migrants. So Derek comes from UC Boulder, currently stationed in Mexico City. It's all yours, Derek.
Thank you very much. Um, if I have any internet problems, please let me know. I've been sort of cutting out here every now and then, but um, yeah. So I don't have a handout, but I'd be more than happy to share a paper when it's finished. Think I'm pretty close to something, um, but I just wanted to start with a quote from Confucius. Right? So Confucius says, when you love a man, you want him to live, and when you hate him, you want him to die. If having wanted him to live, you then want him to die, this is a misguided judgment. If you do not do so for the sake of riches, you must have done so for the sake of novelty. Right. So um, I hope it doesn't seem uncharitable to say that the philosophical literature on immigration seems to be for the sake of novelty. Okay, that's a pretty strong statement, but this is one of those situations that I think is akin to the Peter Singer's Shallow Pond case, like someone arguing that you shouldn't wade into the shallow pond to save the child because you wouldn't get your clothes muddy. It's about as bad or perhaps 60 million people times worse than that, if I could say if I could say that, because that is the current number of migrants who are displaced as a consequence of poverty or issues taking place at the level of government in their home countries. Um, and so, for example, the reason I wanted to focus on migrants' virtues is because of all of the stories I've been reading in the news mostly. In addition to the fact that virtue theory is pretty much absent um, in the literature on immigration. But one story stuck out in particular as representative of why I felt motivated to write on virtue theory and immigration. So, I read a story from 2019 of a Cuban asylum seeker who died in solitary confinement in a Louisiana prison. And his life had a lot of obstacles, but his actions showed him to possess a very virtuous character. Um, in 2011, he was imprisoned for 9 years for attempting to flee Cuba a second time after courageously refusing compulsory military service and protesting the Castro regime. Upon release, he traveled to South America to evade further harassment and discrimination that prevented him from working and beginning his journey to the US. He and his partner lived in Argentina for a year, and they sold juice, and they traversed gang-occupied jungles in the South and Central America. And then after several months, um, passing through several border crossings, they were detained over and over. They lost their paperwork to enter the U.S. Um, and he was detained in Juarez, Mexico. So once he arrived to seek asylum, right, he's detained. And even though he passes credible fear screening and was eligible for parole, his release is denied. A judge demands that he provide evidence of persecution to establish claim for asylum, which is impossible to do when you're detained. So instead, he refused to eat meals to protest the abusive treatment toward him, and was thrown in solitary confinement despite having needed a psychiatric evaluation by medical staff, and he was suffering a painful intestinal disorder. And shortly refusing his 10th meal, he was found having hanged himself with his bed sheets. Right. So, right, this is such a powerful story to me that you don't really read anything like this in the literature, and mostly what you get are narrow discussions about states' alleged right to exclude, right, or right to include, and some like weighing various benefits and drawbacks of increased migration, right? There's almost no mention of the extraordinary efforts and sacrifices that migrants make to secure a better life for themselves and for their families. Um, there's no discussion of migrants possessing virtuous characters, let alone discussions of what the virtues of states would be, right? Um, or how migrants' virtues are cultivated against the background of sometimes extremely vicious policy decisions from Western liberal democracies and the lasting effects of Euro-American colonialism. Um, for example, there's an interesting passage in Christopher Wellman's 2008 paper, which is one of the most discussed papers, it seems to me, recently, where he writes, as implausible as it might initially seem, I suggest that even in cases of asylum seekers desperately in need of political safe haven, a state is not required to take them in. I adopt this stance not because I am unmoved by the plight of asylum seekers, but because I'm not convinced that the only way to help victims of political injustice is by sheltering them in one's political territory. In my view, these people might also be helped in something like the fashion in which wealthy societies could choose to assist impoverished foreigners, by, as it were, exporting justice. Admittedly, one cannot ship justice in a box, but one can intervene militarily if necessary in an unjust political environment to ensure that those currently vulnerable to the state are made safe in their homelands. Um, right, so this is sort of what I mean by the shallow pond example, that in my estimation, and I'm trying to be as charitable as possible, it just seems to me that um, this is like, instead of waiting in the shallow pond to help the drowning child, it's like going to search for a rope, right? Or going to find the alternatively worse ways to get into the pond than get your clothes muddy. Okay. Especially since Wellman's claims don't pass any empirical test, right? That there are, for every example where we ship justice in a box, so to speak, there are dozens of examples where doing so causes hundreds of thousands of people to be displaced, right? Um, so, like in 2009, there were over 2 million Iraqi refugees, and they were displaced largely from the events of the Iraq War. And Syria and Jordan helped uh, alleviate this burden, but one state that closed its doors to these refugees was coincidentally the US, right? So we only admitted 80,000 between 2007 and 2013. Um, and contra Wellman, the problem is not that the US conducted its operations in Iraq suboptimally. The problem is that, for every successful military operation that temporarily prevents some harm to some people, there are several more cases of military blunders that displace millions, right? Okay, so I really don't. I'm trying not to sound charitable, right? But it seems to me that the discussion that is cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, or open borders versus closed borders, right, is a sort of mistaken approach to the discussion. Um, and it's kind of I think really shameful to proceed debating this way, given how significant the injustice is. So, how might virtue theory play a role? I'm not sure. So, um, I'm incredibly uh, wanting, I really dislike the idea of a virtue theory of justice. That doesn't sound very nice to me. So for, just for this paper, I thought about highlighting migrants' virtues and thinking about whether they would expose any corresponding vices in us or in other people that are impediments to migration justice. And yeah, I haven't seen virtue theory be applied this way, but sort of taking a page from Julia Noss, who in her paper, Applying Virtue to Ethics, she says, all we really need to do is get more precise about what virtue is, and then we can start to explain how virtues play a role in the theory. that to me that sounds like a pretty good method. I don't want to get too complicated, right? Um, Especially if the injustices that are taking place are obvious ones. They're ones that almost anyone would rationally agree to, right? They're akin to murder or rape or something like that. Clearly, what happened to the asylum seeker who committed suicide was an act of injustice, and people who are uh, sympathetic to nationalism uh, could easily agree with that, right? Um, they don't need we don't need to convince those people that that was an act of injustice. So I think, and I don't think that this is a I don't think that this is a very peculiar strategy either, to appeal to the virtues of an individual to uncover corresponding vices, because some of our favorite moral exemplars do this, right? So like Martin Luther King's, protest um, is, indicates vices in people who disagreed, with the nonviolent approach. You know, um, I think at the time in 1964, a significant proportion of Americans were still against the Civil Rights Act. Um, and it seems also to me that the purpose of a nonviolent protest is to uncover the vices in people who disagree with you. Um, so I think that this is quite clear, and I would like to focus especially on the vices of citizens, us, I guess, in Western liberal democracies. There, like the epistemic shortcomings of us are extremely obvious. So, 31% of Americans believe that increased immigration makes the economy worse, and 25% say it has little effect. And that's incredibly startling because the consensus among professional economists is that openness creates significant economic gains, right? Um, Only 13% of the US population would be directly competing with immigrants for jobs. And 42% of Americans think that immigrants make crime worse, and 28% think that they make our social and moral values worse. But research shows that Americans attribute high crime to immigrants because the media tends to frame immigrants as especially prone to crime, right? And the evidence from the US shows that immigrants do not increase crime, and some evidence shows that they lessen it in metropolitan areas. So these are like obvious epistemic shortcomings that have, you know, that I think virtue theory would be very is getting better at dealing with after the situationist debate of the early, 2 decades ago. Virtue ethicists are becoming more interested in virtue epistemology, what it means to cultivate, things like epistemic humility, right, and epistemic autonomy. And these virtues, I think, would be very helpful to citizens who don't understand the basic effects, like the basic contributions that immigrants make to society. Um, right. So uh, with with four virtues, I intend to describe how how immigrants possess these virtues and what they reveal about our corresponding vices. So I discuss courage, dignity, hope, and proper pride. Um, and I don't have very sophisticated notions of these virtues. So with respect to courage, I'm just sort of borrowing Socrates' view in the Protagoras. Um, and, but whatever the precise nature of courage is, it's sort of undeniable that migrants are courageous in battles against malnutrition, starvation, disease, undereducation, violence, colonialization, natural disaster, etc. I can just go on and on. Um, and oftentimes they have to have courage to leave their country of origin, which they definitely do not want to do. And they have to face other people sometimes other migrants or their fellow citizens who are impediments as well, or who give sort of bad names to the migrants' plight, right? People who engage in sex trafficking, people who traffic drugs, and um, degrade the quality of migrants' communities, right? Um, so uh, courage, no moral virtue works on its own, but clearly courage must be accompanied by caution or some sort of skillful ability to avoid circumstances that one is inequipped to handle, right? Um, and courage should also be contrasted with cowardice and recklessness. And clearly, I think that military interventions, like the ones that Wellman are suggesting, are acts of recklessness. um, that attempts to sort of nation build or to provide temporary solutions in situations that are novel, right? Where you don't really know what is going to happen because we've never been in such a situation where there are 60 million migrants at a door. Um, right? That's a novel situation. No one could possibly have the adequate epistemic information to make sound judgments. It's clearly, I think, an instance of recklessness to be contrasted with migrants' courage to leave their homes. Um, with respect to hope, I guess I'm borrowing from Adrian Martin's view that the hopeful person is roughly patient and persevering, and they're disposed to act as if some desirable outcome will happen or is likely to happen, because the probability is good enough to permit them being hopeful. Um, my favorite example of this is that before the Israeli Declaration of Independence, approximately half of the population of Mandatory Palestine left or were forced from their homes. Right, despite Israel's absentee property law of 1950, um, denying their return, many Palestinians still hold the keys to their homes prior to displacement, and they hope that one day they'll be able to return and use their keys again. Right. So that seems to me to be highly indicative of the hope I'm interested in, and the way that these large-scale policies can deny individuals the things that they are hopeful of, the things that they are permitted to be hopeful of. Um, I guess I'll conclude by discussing dignity and humility together, because I sort of think they work hand in hand. So when choosing dignity, I wanted to pick a certain kind of virtue of respect or self-respect, right? So for Immanuel Kant, dignity is this sort of high value, the highest value, because it involves treating persons as ends in themselves, right? And um, I guess I would agree with Kant that we should reject kinds of like Aristotelian views of pride and honor, which involve something like social status or accomplishment. I'm interested in something way more robust than that. Um, One way to illustrate the dignity that migrants possess is to view their violation of immigration law as an act of civil disobedience, right? So acts of civil disobedience roughly require that one intentionally break the law, and the lawbreaker is willing to accept the consequences of their violation. Many who are treated unfairly by the law are sometimes thought to have no choice but to violate it if they want to receive fair treatment. And of course, like a good classic example is Rosa Parks, right? So who's uh, her virtuous character revealed a system of racial segregation that wasn't merely inadequate, right? It wasn't merely a subpar policy, as is sometimes said from nationalists who endorse a closed border view. But they reveal that the system is seriously unjust, and no individual should defend such a system that needlessly allows the suffering of human beings. Um, and of course, as mentioned in the case at the beginning of my talk, that many migrants who are detained engage in hunger protests. And another story I read, there was someone who was forced to sign documents that he couldn't read because he didn't speak English, but he was forced to sign them that delayed his proceedings. It essentially denied him fair proceedings. Uh, and he and about 20 other people participated in a hunger strike, and none of them had court dates for their cases. Right, so I've tied dignity and humility together because I think that this is a clear act of self-respect that indicates serious injustices in the system. I guess I can conclude by saying what my policy view is, and so I don't intend to say that there's such a thing, such a policy view that can be generated from virtue theory, but I guess I would ask philosophers writing on immigration to not ask whether our borders should be open or closed, but how open, right? And to what extent, given individuals and states' virtues and vices, right? I think that openness is a function of virtue and vice, pretty much. So like careless optimism about migrants would entail that we should be less open, right? But clearly there is not careless optimism, right? There's careless pessimism. So I think that we should be more open. Yeah, that's a good place to stop.
Nice job, Derek.
Thank you.
So questions can go in the chat. So we'll give people a minute or two. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. And panelists, if you have a question, you can just speak. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I had a question. Thanks for your talk. I was just wondering, when you're talking about a virtue theory of justice and collective virtues, if virtues are dispositions that make a motivational contribution to action, like they do on a lot of virtue theories, does that raise any difficulties for talking about collective virtues?
I don't think so. And I don't think that it's necessary to talk about collective virtue at such an early stage, I guess, in introducing virtue into the debate, because, and I sort of think of what happened to Miranda Fricker when she wrote Epistemic Injustice, that she introduced this virtue of testimonial justice, and then like in the last decade, people are upset because her view is overly individualistic, right, or something like that. But yeah, I sort of feel that individualism is not too bad, and I would just focus on the individual for now, actually.
So Greg's question is, say more about, it's pretty similar, say more about why you don't like the virtue theory of justice. Does virtue theory address vice as having structural causes? So it's kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so I think it can. I don't think that it's sufficient, right? So I don't think that talking about individual virtue is sufficient for addressing structural injustices. And I just sort of think that since most, even deontological and utilitarian accounts have been insufficient at describing what it is about migrants that is good. There's no easier way to put that, I guess. That um, introducing a complex theory of justice doesn't seem to be helpful. Just the standard Aristotelian account would be good. I guess I'm extremely pessimistic about, since, if someone, like Alison Jagger, right, is writing on migration justice, and she's just as baffled as everyone else. I guess I'm like, well, it's kind of okay to not have a comprehensive theory of justice. It might just overcomplicate things, and that's sort of how I feel, especially given the immense immensity of the wrongness taking place, right?
So we've got time for one more question from Andy. Is one of your concerns the basic difference between ethical theory and political theory? So a very fundamental question. Virtue being about the individuals versus legal regimes that are the result of political processes.
Um, I'm not sure. So, as far as I know, no one has really taken virtue theory, like created a political theory directly out of virtue ethics. And I mean, even I sort of think of like Adam Smith's view, which Adam Smith's theory of virtue seems to be completely separated from his political theory, and that's not too problematic. Uh, that that's the case, and I don't know if it's necessary to develop um, a political theory or to be overly concerned with any differences between the two. Um, yeah. Um, and I'm not sure what I would say about legal regimes, uh, except that I'm an anarchist. So so then like my political philosophy is pretty much non-existent, and so just that um, any acts of civil disobedience in the name of justice is perfectly fine with me. So I'm not quite sure what I would say.
You know, we had in the, if you don't mind if I unmute
Mm.
myself, in the other room in the previous session, there was a discussion of Tolstoy's pacifism and anarchism. And there is this conflict, you know, when if what matters are the lives of individuals and their well-being, and if the state is going to do something different because they're operating at a different level, I think you're onto something there. That's a good point. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Derek and Andy for chiming in. So we're gonna go to our last presenter, Dean Coslovi, sorry, Dean. And the title is The Gentle Way, the Philosophy of Judo and the Life of Yoshio Senda. So it's all yours, Dean.
All right, so I have a presentation with this. I'm just gonna screen share it with you guys. All right, good, yep, it's looking good. Everybody can hear me all right? Sounds good, let's get to it. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dean Coslovi, and for my contribution to the Peace and Hope in Dark Times Conference, I will be presenting The Gentle Way, the Philosophy of Judo and the Life of Yoshio Senda. The purpose of this presentation is to highlight that there is always a reason to hope, even in the darkest of times. However, hope alone is not enough. Action is required. The philosophy of Judo is a philosophy of action. The life of Dr. Yoshio Senda, better known as Yosh, demonstrates how living a life dedicated to this philosophy can foster peace and make the world a better place. Now, before we dive in, I want to briefly touch upon the topics that this presentation will cover. First, I will explain what Judo is, as well as delve into the history and philosophy behind this martial art. Once this is complete, I can then describe how Yosh Senda applied this philosophy to his life. Following this, I will have a few concluding remarks. All right, let's get to it. So, Judo is a sport and martial art that consists of throwing, pinning, strangulation, and joint locking techniques. Judo originated in Japan in the late 1880s, shortly after the Meiji Restoration, and has been an Olympic sport since 1964. Since that time, Judo has spread around the globe with over 50 million estimated participants. Currently, there are 204 members of the International Judo Federation. To put that into perspective, the UN only has a measly 193 member states. However, despite the international nature of Judo today, the origins of Judo can, remarkably, be traced to a single person in 19th century Japan, Jigoro Kano. In the beginning, Kano sought out martial arts for the same reason that many people do. He found himself to be the frequent victim of bullies in his youth. At this time in Japan, there were other styles of hand-to-hand combat that were being taught at various jujutsu schools, which derived their techniques from the fighting methods utilized by the samurai on the battlefield in ages past. For Kano, studying martial arts had its desired effect, as bullies soon learned to steer clear of this unassuming and studious young man. These results only deepened Kano's interest in martial arts. Kano continued studying various styles of martial arts through his late teens and early 20s as he attended Tokyo University. It was during this time that Kano began to formulate his own style of martial art. Being a naturally smaller man, Kano could not use techniques that relied upon brute strength and size. As a result, he often struggled in sparring matches against his adult training partners. However, this turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Rather than being able to rely upon physical attributes, Kano found it necessary to study the principles of martial arts and the basic workings of human anatomy in order to apply techniques that would work against larger and stronger opponents. This is how Kano began to develop judo. Kano recognized that size and strength should not be the determining factor in a martial arts effectiveness. Rather, with proper timing and the proper application of power, Kano recognized that technique will always overcome brute strength and aggression. This idea is the essence of judo. With properly applied technique, a smaller person can overcome a larger person by using the larger person's power against them. The term judo itself is composed of two concepts, ju, meaning gentleness, and do, meaning the way or the path. Thus, the meaning of judo is the gentle way. For Kano, judo was not simply an extremely effective collection of techniques. Rather, Kano saw judo as being a way of life. In order to understand how Kano saw judo as a way of life, it is necessary to understand Kano's thoughts on both the principle and the purpose of judo. According to Kano, the principle of judo is seryoku zenyo, meaning maximum efficient use of energy. By using an opponent's power against them, judoka always seek to use their own energy in the most efficient way possible in order to defeat their adversary. A relatively small amount of force can produce dramatic results when applied properly. While this principle is at the core of judo, Kano advocated that the maximum efficient use of energy should be applied to one's every endeavor in life. In this way, Kano saw seryoku zenyo as being a guiding principle that should direct one's actions towards only the most efficient uses of one's limited mental and physical energy. Once one masters the principle of seryoku zenyo in the dojo, Kano believed that judoka should endeavor to carry out the purpose of judo, known as jitakyue, meaning mutual welfare and benefit of all. For Kano, one could not claim to understand judo if one's moral virtue did not develop in tandem with one's martial skill. Thus, in Kano's view, if one understands the principle of judo, then it necessarily follows that one should also understand the purpose of judo. In this way, Kano saw the act of mastering the martial art of judo as a means of also mastering the art of living well by being of benefit to the world. In order to teach this way of life, a 22-year-old Kano opened his first judo dojo, which he named the Kodokan, meaning the hall where the way is taught. According to Kano, judo is the way of the highest or most efficient use of both physical and mental energy. Through training in the techniques of judo, the practitioner nurtures their physical and mental strength and gradually embodies the essence of the way. Thus, the ultimate objective of judo is self-perfection and to make a positive contribution to society. For Kano, there were to be no Sunday judoka who simply followed the principles of judo in the dojo, but did not embody these principles in everyday life. In Kano's view, if judoka could use their efforts for the mutual welfare and benefit of others, then the world would necessarily be a better place. This is the philosophy of judo. Needless to say, not all practitioners of judo live up to this lofty standard. However, some do. Yash Senda was born on February 14th, 1922 in Mission City, British Columbia, Canada, which is presently located in the Greater Vancouver area. Yash was the son of first-generation Japanese-Canadian parents and was raised on a strawberry farm along with his 6 siblings. Yash's father, Kaiichi, had attained his brown belt in judo before leaving Japan, so Yash was introduced to judo at a very young age. Although Yash undoubtedly had countless hours of practice with his brothers and sisters at home, it wasn't until the age of 8 that Yash formally began his judo training. However, from that day until the moment he passed away, Yash never stopped living a life dedicated to judo. Yash's time as a sensei teaching judo alone spans over 6 decades. By the end of his career, Yash's accomplishments and accolades were remarkable. In terms of judo, Yash was an Olympic coach, the first ninth degree black belt in Canadian history, and the highest ranking black belt in Canada. Yash would also be honored with numerous awards, including both the highest civilian honor given to Canadians, the Order of Canada, and the Order of the Sacred Treasure, gold and silver rays, which was conferred upon him by His Majesty, the Emperor of Japan. However, despite these successes and honors, Yash's path in life was by no means an easy one. As a judo competitor, Yash excelled and he won the Canadian Junior National Championships in 1937. The following year, Yash would again excel competitively by defeating all the other competitors in a local tournament. Yash's sensei took note of this performance and recommended Yash for his black belt. Apparently being the Canadian champion wasn't quite enough in those days. Yash's potential in judo was so well recognized that he was given an opportunity for an all expenses paid trip to train in Japan. In summation, Yash's budding judo career was beginning to have a bright future. That was until the outbreak of hostilities between Japan and Canada in 1941. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Canada immediately declared war on Japan, and a wave of anti-Japanese sentiment swept across the nation. A general paranoia regarding the loyalty of Japanese Canadians reached a fever pitch at the beginning of 1942. In response, Ottawa categorized approximately 22,000 Japanese Canadians as enemy aliens and began to forcibly remove all persons of Japanese racial origin away from their homes on the west coast of Canada. Canadian citizenship was irrelevant. The property of these enemy aliens, ranging from houses to even family heirlooms, was confiscated by the Canadian government and sold off for pennies on the dollar. In just a few short months, Japanese Canadians had gone from being citizens of Canada to being robbed of their rights and their property. This is the dark situation that Yash and his family found themselves in. This was a time of great fear and hopelessness. The Senda family was shipped by train to work on a sugar beet farm in southern Alberta. When they arrived, the family was provided with a chicken coop to live in, along with several other families. It was during these dark times when Yash's embodiment of the philosophy of judo becomes clear. Yash could not change the fact that he and his fellow Japanese Canadians were the victims of one of the worst injustices in Canadian history. However, this did not mean that Yash's life was over as well. Rather than spending his mental and physical energy trying to change the unchangeable, Yash demonstrated his understanding of the principle of judo, Seiryu Kuzenyo, by being supple and adapting to change gracefully. In the fall of 1943, Yash was given an opportunity to be an assistant coach at a new judo club opening up in the small farming town of Raymond, Alberta. Although this was an unpaid position and Yash would be forced to leave his family, Yash gladly accepted. Yash could not have known how this decision would be the start of an incredible teaching career spanning over 6 decades that continues to make a positive impact on generations of people. However, Yash believed in Kano's vision of using judo as a means of promoting peace and the betterment of humanity. Specifically, Yash understood that the best way to focus his energy in this uncertain time was towards jitakyue, or the mutual welfare and benefit of others. For Yash, the opportunity to assist judo practices was not simply a way to stay involved in the martial art that he loved. Rather, this opportunity provided Yash with a means to use his energy to help others. This is the way of judo, and Yash's life is a testament to this philosophy. In order to teach judo in Raymond, Yash began living out of a local hotel and took any odd jobs he could find in order to make ends meet. Following the war, Yash was presented with an opportunity to start a new judo club at the YMCA in Lethbridge, Alberta. Since Lethbridge was the largest population center in the region, the chance to get more people involved in judo was too great for Yash to pass up. However, despite the fact that the war was now over, the lasting scars of the Canadian government's racist policies still plagued Japanese Canadians. Before Yash and his wife Florence were allowed to buy a home in Lethbridge, there was a neighborhood vote to determine whether Yash, Flo, and their 2 young children would be allowed to move onto the south side of town. This was in 1952. Despite these obstacles, Yash was allowed to settle in South Lethbridge, and he opened the Lethbridge Kyotokan Judo Club that same year. Like everything he did in life, Yash put a great deal of thought into the naming of his new judo club. The term Kyotokan can be translated as the bridging of ways. From this name, Yash's intention for his judo club becomes clear. For Yash, his judo club would serve as a place where there could be a bridging of ways, both at a cultural level and at an individual level. Although no one can change the injustices of the past, Yash clearly understood that he could do his part to ensure that the past never repeated itself by creating a place that fostered cross-cultural understanding and the development of good people. In the beginning, the judo club held practices 2 nights a week on mats sewn together by Yash's wife, Flo. Before long, however, interest in judo and the teachings of the gentle way sparked interest from a growing community in Lethbridge to a point where practice was eventually held 6 days a week. The interest was so broad that different age and belt classes were held each day, save Sunday. Yash taught every single one of these classes and was still attending practice well into his 80s. Even when he was undergoing cancer treatment, Yash would fly to and from Calgary for his treatment in the same day so that he could still make it to judo. With this sort of dedication, it should come as no surprise that competitive results soon became a hallmark of Yash's coaching career. However, this was never Yash's focus. From its inception, the Lethbridge Kyotokan Judo Club was modeled after Yash's understanding of the philosophy of judo. In Yash's view, whether it be competitive or recreational, as a judoka, you are training yourself to be a good person. Whatever you do in life, judo, school, or work, give it your best effort, develop yourself so that you will be a benefit to society. This is the philosophy that Yash endeavored to teach all of his students. This is the philosophy of judo, and this is the way Yash lived his life. He followed the way. Although Yash passed away in 2009, his legacy lives on today. The Lethbridge Kyotokan Judo Club is still in operation and is being managed by Yash's former students. Following the example Yash set, all the coaching, administration, and maintenance of the judo club is completed entirely by volunteers. While the Lethbridge Kyotokan Judo Club has long been recognized as one of the top clubs in North America and is currently designated as a national regional training center for Canadian athletes, the club still offers adult recreation classes and classes for children as young as 4. All of these judoka, young or old, are taught about the philosophy of judo and the life of Yash Senda. In short, Yash's lifelong dedication has and continues to make a positive impact on countless lives. Yash made the world a better place. So to wrap up, here are the lessons that Yash's life and the philosophy of judo can provide. In the face of dark times, it is easy to feel hopeless. However, as this presentation has demonstrated, there's always a way to create a more positive future through one's actions. The martial art of judo itself gives one the understanding that power and strength do not always dictate outcomes. Through a willingness to be supple and by having a dedication to the betterment of all, any individual can create peace and hope in dark times. By embodying the philosophy of judo, Yash Senda did not allow dark circumstances to overpower his life. Instead, Yash recognized that there was always an opportunity to direct his actions towards the mutual welfare and benefit of others. This is how he lived his life. As a result, Yash was and remains a symbol of hope and light to everyone who knew him. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you so much, Dean. So we'll have comments again in the webinar
good.
chat. It looks like there's one already.
Okay.
Richard Gregg famously called nonviolence moral jujitsu for social transformation. Does your approach contribute to this insight?
Well, I'm actually not sure about what Greg's approach to non-violence moral jiu-jitsu would be, but I would imagine if he's following the principles of jiu-jitsu, which are relatively the same as judo, then um, oh, sorry, then yeah, it would likely be the same. Um, the philosophy of judo is about not meeting force with force, not meeting confrontation with more confrontation, but being able to bend and adapt to the different situations you find yourself in, um, and be able to use whatever is coming towards you and optimize it to um, producing the best result. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I'll have to look up Richard Gregg after this presentation. Thank you. Rachel Dieter, did you know this individual personally? Yes, I did. Josh was my grandfather, so I had many years to obviously get to know him, but just to see the impact that he made on people's lives. As I get older, it's much more significant. What he did was much more significant. It's easy to say, yeah, just go to practice 6 days a week. Just even to do that now is difficult, but then to say to do that for 60 years of your life, over 60 years of your life, going to work all day, coming home, having a bite to eat, and then volunteering your time to train people in judo and to bring it wasn't just training judo, it was the philosophical lessons that all the kids take away from the classes and the adults. I mean, the community is still here now. The club is still being run entirely by volunteers, and it truly made a difference in this area. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Andy has a question. The virtue traditions,
Yeah.
Greek and other, focus on training and education, but in academia, we usually focus on mental training. To what degree do you think physical training is important for training in virtue and in nonviolence?
I think it's extremely important. Just going back to Kano's philosophy, that was the basis of understanding, that one of the bases for understanding judo. If you understand how to defend yourself, then you also understand that you don't need to use violence. Not every situation, actually, in fact, no situation really needs to escalate to the point of violence. And even if you are attacked, there's many famous stories of judoka just simply throwing people harmlessly onto the ground and immobilizing them. I didn't have to do anything. It was a sort of violent, but it wasn't brutally violent in any means. I guess just to sum up what I'm trying to say, the act of physically training yourself to be martially competent allows you to have the confidence to not need to use violence. And that allows you to use your words. You can start to de-escalate the situation because you feel no threat. So I think that physical training is extremely important in the training of virtue.
Dean, I have a question for you. I don't know judo very well. I have taught Chinese philosophy. I don't know much about Japanese philosophy, but a lot of this sounds very Taoist to me. But also I can hear a little Confucianism as well, in that self-growth leads to betterment of society as such.
Yes.
And there's a ripple effect there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, in terms of historical influence, is there influence on both sides, Taoism and Confucianism?
Yes, there is, but also importantly, Kano he didn't write specifically that I found anyway, that he labeled himself as, I took this from Confucianism, I took this from Taoism. What we do know about his, I guess, sort of academic training is that he attended Tokyo University at a time when there was at least half the faculty that were teaching English philosophy. So he actually took a lot of lessons from John Dewey and his ideas on education, as well as blending in more Eastern traditions. So his ideas are a hybrid of a lot of different things. So you can pick up many different elements, but definitely the Confucianism is in there.
Yeah, thanks.
Mhm.
We've got time for maybe one more question. Yeah, Greg pointed out that Dewey did go to China for a little bit there. Yep, that's absolutely right.
Thanks, Rick.
Oh, okay, so no more questions. That was excellent panel. I really appreciated it. Keynote is in about 15 minutes, so we have a little break here, and it's in this room. Correct, Andy?
Yeah, that's right. And Greg, I don't know if you want to, thank you to the panelists. This was really great. Greg, I don't know if you want to give any more info about what's happening next in the keynote and so on.
Sure. Yeah, I really did enjoy this panel. And it's always nice when you put a panel together to see how it works together, right? That all these individual papers, when they're put together, work. But also to see geographically. I mean, this was the North American panel, right? We covered the bases. We got Canada, we got Mexico, we got Indiana. So